in the entertainment industry and your acting career when you met with him?
Objection, relevance. Sustained. 350, 352.
I'd like to turn now to the months, ma'am, I'd like to turn now to the months of April, May, and June of 2009, focusing first on April. Was Conrad Murray living with you in your apartment in Los Angeles in April of 2009?
Yes.
Was he living with you on a full-time basis? In other words, every day?
Well, he was working, I believe, continuing to maintain his practices in Houston and Vegas, so he wasn't there on a full-time basis.
Were you aware that he was treating Mr. Jackson in April of 2009?
I was aware that he was his personal physician.
Were you aware that he was providing treatment to Mr. Jackson in April of 2009?
I was aware that he was his personal physician, so...
Do you understand my question?
No.
Okay, I'll try to make it...
No, I understand your question. My answer is no.
Okay, so let's back up, please. In April of 2009, Conrad Murray stayed at your apartment, correct?
Yes.
And would he leave in the evening times to go to his job as Michael Jackson's physician?
Yes.
And what did you believe that Conrad Murray was doing in relationship to the time he spent with Michael Jackson?
Objection, relevance. Overruled. I'm sorry, what? Overruled on that ground. You may answer.
I didn't believe anything. I knew he was working with Michael. To what capacity, I wasn't sure.
Well, you said earlier that you knew that he was Mr. Jackson's personal physician. Did I understand you correctly when you provided that answer?
Yes, Mrs. Brazil.
So at that point in time, in April of 2009, when Conrad Murray would leave in the evenings to go to work, he was providing care for Mr. Jackson, correct?
Yes.
And during the month of May, he was still going back and forth to his medical practice in Las Vegas as well as his practice in Houston, correct?
Yes.
And when he was staying at your apartment in April of 2009, was he maintaining a routine of providing care for Michael Jackson primarily in the evening times?
Yes.
And describe what you observed or knew to be his routine as it relates to his working as Mr. Jackson's attorney, working as Mr. Jackson's physician in April of 2009.
Describe to you the routine?
Yes.
My observations?
Yes, I'm interested in his schedule. You've told us that he provided care to Mr. Jackson primarily in the evening times, correct?
Yes.
So I'm interested in your knowledge or observations of his routine as it related to his schedule of providing medical care to Mr. Jackson.
Okay, I remember that he would leave at around 9 p.m. and I'm using 9 p.m. as a marker because I would put my son to sleep at 9. So I specifically remember him leaving around that time. And he would return in the morning, sometimes early morning, sometimes 10, 9. I remember that when he would, in the beginning when he was working for Michael, he would come back early, really early, like 6 or 7. And then it went to 8, and then it was 9. It became later and later.
And when you say 6 and 8 and 9, you're referring to the AM time, correct?
Yes.
During the time that Conrad Murray was at your apartment in April of 2009, would his schedule be regular in that every night that he was there, would he keep the schedule that you just described for us in providing care for Mr. Jackson?
Leaving around 9 p.m. and returning in the morning, yes.
And it was every day that he took those duties. Is that accurate?
I don't recall if it was every day. I don't recall if it was exactly every day, like Monday through Sunday. Is that what or are you meaning Monday through Friday?
I'm just referring to the frequency, so however it is easier for you to describe it, that's fine.
Every day, very frequently. Some days he wouldn't go.
That would be perhaps a day off.
Yeah.
I'd like to turn now to the month of May of 2009. Was Conrad Murray living with you at your apartment in May of 2009?
Yes.
And at that point in time, was he also, to your knowledge and observations, providing care to Michael Jackson?
Yes.
And would the schedule that you've just described for us related to Conrad Murray's activities in April be the same in substance in May? For example, would he leave around 9 p.m. as you described, be gone for the entire evening, and then return sometime in the morning hours of the next day? Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
And it was your understanding, ma'am, that Conrad Murray was providing care to Mr. Jackson, correct?
Yes.
And that care was being provided at Mr. Jackson's residence. Was that your understanding?
I guess so, yes.
Well, did Conrad Murray ever tell you where he was going when he was leaving every night and providing care to Michael Jackson?
I think it was just understood. He never would tell me specifically every day, I'm going to Michael's. It was like, I'm going to work. So I guess I assumed he was going to Michael's residence, yes.
And you didn't have any reason to think he was anyplace else, do you?
No.
Did you ever call Conrad Murray after the time that he left your residence during the time that he was caring for Michael Jackson?
Yes.
And how frequently or how often would you call Dr. Murray while he was working for Mr. Jackson?
I don't recall it being too frequent. I was very tired.
But you would in fact call him?
At times, yes.
And when you called him, did the two of you have a conversation?
It was always very brief. So, a short conversation, yes.
Turning now to the month of June. In June of 2009, was Conrad Murray living with you at your apartment on 6th Street in Santa Monica?
Yes.
Was Conrad Murray's schedule much the same in the month of June as it relates to his leaving in the evening hours to provide care for Michael Jackson?
Yes.
Would you say that in June, Conrad Murray spent more time at your apartment and then going to work for Mr. Jackson in June than he did in the previous months, or about the same?
I think it's fair to say probably about the same.
And you describe that as being virtually every night except a night off here and there?
Yes.
Let's strike that. So you were obviously aware that Mr. Jackson was preparing for his concert tour in London, correct?
Yes.
Did Conrad Murray ever tell you that he had attended rehearsals?
I don't recall.
Did you ever ask Conrad Murray if he attended a rehearsal?
No.
You weren't even curious about how it was going?
I thought I was going to see the show.
Well, were you planning to accompany Conrad Murray to London?
Yes.
And when did you become aware that you would be accompanying Conrad Murray to London?
I want to say it was sometime after March.
Would that be, you're placing that after the time your son was born?
Yes.
Were you aware that Conrad Murray was negotiating his contract for employment services as Michael Jackson's physician prior to the...
Sorry.
I'll sustain the objection. You can ask the specific question of whether she was told by the defense.
Did Conrad Murray tell you that he was negotiating a contract for payment for his services as Michael Jackson's physician?
I wasn't aware specifically about the negotiations that were involved, but I knew that we were planning to go, and they were working things out as to about where we were going to be living, the time frame. So as to the details, I'm not sure what that involved, no.
Well, did you know that Conrad Murray's monthly compensation was set to be $150,000 per month?
I learned that later on, but at the time, no.
How did you learn that later on?
Through what I've gathered through the media and news. And
Didn't you see it on the contract when the contract was faxed to your apartment?
no.
Objection, leading lack of foundation.
Assumes facts not in evidence. The objection sustained, the answer stricken. Disregard, please.
Ma'am, do you have a fax machine, or did you have a fax machine in your apartment in 2009 in June?
I did have a fax machine, but it was never, it's not a fax machine that's hooked up. It's off to the side, and because of the phone line is across the room and it's not in a convenient place, it doesn't stay on. So if someone is going to receive a fax, they need to move the fax machine and hook it up. So I had one, yes.
And didn't you receive a fax and notify Conrad Murray that his contract had been faxed to him in late June of 2009?
I don't-
Objection, leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
I don't ever recall receiving a fax for him.
Ms. Alvarez, in September of 2009, do you remember testifying in a court proceeding?
Yes,
And in fact, Mr. Walgren asked you questions, correct?
yes.
And during that proceeding, Mr. Walgren asked you whether or not you saw the contract between AEG and Dr. Murray, and your answer was yes. Do you recall that?
I do recall,
And Mr. Walgren asked you, and in that contract, it indicated that he would be receiving a monthly payment, and your answer was yes.
I never read the details of the contract. If it came through my fax, I recall seeing a fax, but as to what it was, I don't recall that.
Ms. Alvarez, Mr. Walgren asked you what was that amount, and your answer was $150,000, I believe. Question, a month? Answer, yes. Mr. Walgren then asked you, and how was it that you saw that contract? Answer, it was in the fax machine. At your apartment? Yes. You
That is
further-
correct?
So it is, in fact, accurate that you received a fax at your apartment and you looked at the contract and were aware that Conrad Murray was seeking and would be paid $150,000 per month.
I honestly don't recall that. If it was in the fax machine, then it was in the fax machine. It's not something that I was accustomed to doing, his business and receiving his faxes. I'm not his secretary, his assistant. I don't recall the specifics. But yes, if it was in the fax machine, then that is correct.
Well, in fact, you were under oath at the prior proceeding when you were answering Mr. Walgren's questions. You remember that, don't you?
Yes.
And you answered truthfully and told Mr. Walgren that the contract had come through the fax machine. You were curious and you looked at it, and that's how you knew some details about the contracts. You would agree that you told the truth when you told Mr. Walgren that, didn't you, Ms. Alvarez?
Absolutely. But as of this moment, I don't recall that specific moment. There's been a lot that has been going on over the past 2 years, and things do become very blurry. So if that's what I said, that's what happened.
So in fact, thank you, Ms. Walgren. So in fact, you knew in September of 2009 some of the details concerning the tour and your plans to accompany Conrad Murray. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Were you planning to give up your apartment in Santa Monica, or were you going to keep it
Objection,
when you went on tour?
Overruled. You may answer.
Okay. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet.
Were you pretty excited about going on tour?
Yes.
So when did you start packing to go on tour?
I never finished packing.
Did you know when you were leaving?
No.
Were you expecting that you would find out those details
Eventually.
shortly?
Yes.